and welcome back to my channel, where I talk about retro pop culture and other nonsense. A while ago, I did a poll asking what my next video topic should be, and the winner was a ranking of the John Hughes teen films of the 1980s. But when I sat down to rewatch these films and was taking notes and kind of getting all of my thoughts together, I realized that there was a much more interesting and better video to be made out of that concept. And this, hopefully, is the much better video. What I realized while watching these films, reading about them, and discussing them with other people is that the films John Hughes made in the 80s weren't just coming-of-age films. They were important cultural moments that had far-reaching ramifications on teen media and pop culture as a whole. These movies became such an important part of the American pop culture lexicon that even if you haven't seen them, you probably know them and recognize them. You recognize the stories, the quotes, the music, the outfits, because they were just that important and timeless. And before we can even approach a ranking of these films, we need to understand what exactly makes them great and why they've become such iconic classics that everyone knows, regardless of whenever they were born. Each film has its own individual charms, but together they make a body of work that says more about the American teenage experience than any one of them does separately. And that's what I want to talk about here today. So instead of looking at each film individually, we're going to explore the history of the coming-of-age craze in the 1980s as a whole. And we're going to examine what sets these films apart from other entries in the teen film canon. What's so interesting about this group of films is that they really were lightning in a bottle. The American cultural landscape at the time they were released was a big part of what made them so iconic, and it might be why we've never seen it replicated on quite the scale since. But what's also interesting is that even today, in a very different cultural landscape, these films are still so relatable to teenagers from all walks of life. And they're still so popular in a way that teen films from other decades just aren't. No one remembers Beach Blanket Bingo, but we all remember the first time we cringed at Andy's prom dress in Pretty in Pink. So today we're going to talk in depth about how 1980s society shaped these films and the teenagers that grew up on them, and vice versa, and why we're still drawn to them even today. I also want to talk about some of the ways these films aren't entirely timeless and maybe haven't aged so well, and how we come to terms with the more harmful elements of our favorite retro films. There are lessons to be learned even from those mistakes, and I think that any proper discussion of media should always include ways that we can learn to do and be better. And then, finally, at the very end, I am going to give you my personal ranking of the Hughes teen 80s films, because I would feel like a complete monster if I made you sit through an hour of in-depth media analysis without at least giving you what you voted for in the polls. Oh, I should probably tell you what films we're talking about, huh? The movies we're going to be covering today are 16 Candles, Pretty in Pink, The Breakfast Club, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and Some Kind of Wonderful. You might notice Weird Science isn't included. That's nothing really against Weird Science, it's just that the film not only didn't have the impact that the others did, it's just kind of an outlier in the 80s Hughes canon overall. We might touch on it a little bit here and there, but I mostly didn't include it because tonally it's just so different from all of the other films, and I just didn't really have a whole lot to say about it. But anyway, those are the 5 films we're going to be discussing. I am really excited to talk about it, and I hope you are too. But before all that, a quick word from our sponsor, me. Now let's talk about cinesociology, bad prom dresses, and the timeless allure of teen angst. Before we get into what makes these films great, we need to understand just how impactful they were on wider American pop culture, and talk a little bit more about the man who made them. In his 1986 review of Ferris Bueller's Day Off, our good old friend Roger Ebert called Hughes the Philosopher of Adolescence, and that description is the one that I've seen repeated the most when discussing Hughes's work and way of viewing the world. He was in many ways a man who never really grew out of his teenage mindset, and despite how that may have colored his working relationships toward the end of his career, it did give him a unique perspective and approach to his work that no other screenwriter or director could match. Born February 18th, 1950, John Hughes came from a modest and very average background. Even as a child, Hughes was known for being artistic, sensitive, and a bit of a loner. He had 3 younger sisters who he apparently wasn't very close to, and according to a childhood friend, he didn't have the best relationship with his parents either. Allegedly, they were domineering and harsh and would criticize John for his interest in the arts and tell him he'd never amount to anything, which explains quite a few of his characters, actually. His family moved to an affluent neighborhood in Chicago when he was a teenager, and his experiences growing up in a high-pressure, middle-class family in this environment shaped his views on the adolescent class divide, something we're going to be discussing more in-depth later. He worked as a copywriter for a while before trying his hand at comedy writing, and he was a regular contributor to National Lampoon magazine, where he wrote his first screenplay in 1982. National Lampoon's Class Reunion, which was, not good. It's not a good movie. But that's okay, because the next year he released 2 much better and more successful films, Mr. Mom and National Lampoon's Vacation. Both of these films gave us the first real taste of Hughes' signature writing style, which combines sharp humor with an all-American everyman wholesomeness. He had a real knack for taking the simplest story premise, a dad takes care of his kids, a family goes on vacation, and making it not only hilarious but genuinely heartfelt. It was a signature style that would hallmark the rest of his work, especially during the 80s, and had a marked influence on screenwriting as a whole. This style, that of the simple, average family comedy with something surprising to say about life, has been duplicated by countless screenwriters and directors because it works, and it all started with John Hughes. He had a distinctive cinematic voice that may have wavered at times, but could generally be counted on to deliver something special and universally appealing. Says film critic Eric Hines, "He gives you a laugh and then he gives you a cry. That's how life works. This is what it's like to be human." The influence of John Hughes' work, and especially his coming-of-age 80s films, cannot be overstated. These films had a lasting impact not only on the film industry, proving that stories about teenagers could be marketable and profitable, but most especially on the teens and young adults who experienced them. These weren't films about fantastical situations far removed from their own lives. They were relatable stories that mirrored the real struggles and triumphs of American adolescence at the time. That was a rare thing then, and it's an even rarer thing now. Nowadays, the teen blockbuster is usually a fantasy or a dystopia. Think The Hunger Games, Harry Potter, Twilight, Divergent. Okay, maybe calling that last one a blockbuster is a little bit of a stretch. But big teen movies today are usually dark and fantastical with high stakes and higher CGI budgets. The deeper themes may be universally relatable, but the immediate circumstances the characters find themselves in are not. Hopefully, anyway. Even films based in reality aren't about the average teenage experience. Even if they represent the lived experience of some teenager somewhere, the chances that the kid sitting in the audience has lived through that same thing are pretty low. Now, I am not saying that contemporary stories about kids outside of the experience of the 99% are unimportant or shouldn't be told. I'm just trying to explain that there is a reason that this set of films from nearly 40 years ago has stood the test of time and are still so universally beloved. It's because they're universally relatable in a more immediate way. According to Hadley Freeman, author of Life Moves Pretty Fast, The Lessons We Learned from 80s Movies, it's easy to make a movie feel dramatic when the stakes are as high as the characters' lives, as they are in Twilight and The Hunger Games. Even a vaguely more realistic film like The Fault in Our Stars plays on this. It is trickier to give a movie emotional heft when it focuses on average people's average lives, and the fact is, most teen audiences will be average kids. John Hughes told those kids that their stories were worth telling. I have that book right here. It is a fantastic book, and I highly recommend it. Ducky, no! I think that's why these stories became so popular and why they remain so popular, because they don't believe that mundane teenage life is boring. Hughes shows that while the fate of the world may not rest on the shoulders of a few kids in detention, their emotional lives still matter, and therefore the emotional lives of the young people watching matter. And for many of them, it may be the first time they've been told that. But there's more to these films' secret recipe of success than simple, universal themes and biting sincerity. These films came out during the perfect time in American history to make the biggest impact on their intended audience. And to understand that, we get to have a vaguely related history lesson, because I'm a video essayist on YouTube. As with any piece of media, the best way to understand its creation and its impact is to look at the surrounding culture of the time period in which it was made. And this may come as a shock, but the 1980s was a wild time. While it may not have been as bombastically turbulent as the 60s, the 80s in America was a period of extreme transition. The 70s were all about rebellion and rejection of the status quo, and the 90s were a time of social and technological progression. So that in-between period can look a little bit static. But the truth is that it was probably the time of greatest cultural change, if not for the world at large, then for the average American household. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, because that's how much research I did for this video, in March 1985, nearly half of all wives with infant children 1 year old or under were in the labor force, compared with only 31% in 1975. 54% of the mothers of 2-year-olds were working or looking for work, as were 62% of those with 5-year-olds. For mothers of school-age children, the proportion ranged between 64 and 71%. Basically, what all those numbers mean is that American family dynamics changed drastically in the 1980s. Suddenly, you had both parents in the workforce, and the children were having to navigate growing up in a post-Vietnam world largely on their own, or at least more on their own than children of past generations had been. Kids were suddenly a lot less supervised than they had been in the past, and society started to fear teenagers in a way they hadn't before. Take the protests and drug culture of the 70s and the sudden concern for the fate of latchkey kids and mix them together, and you get a bunch of adults who no longer trust their teenage children to not become drug-crazed hippies, regardless of whether or not that was a fear actually founded in reality. The teens of the 1980s also had to contend with a lot more pressure than the generation that had come before them. The baby boomers were numerous, prosperous, and, well, boomers. It was just expected that Gen Xers would become just as prosperous and conformist as their boomer parents had been, despite the fact that they were growing up in a very different world than the boomers did. Something that millennials and Gen Zers can't relate to and would never understand. As Susanna Gora, author of You Couldn't Ignore Me If You Tried, puts it, because of national cultural shifts occurring throughout their adolescence, 80s teens were an often overlooked, undervalued, and misunderstood group. The 60s and 70s teenagers changed the world, and all the 80s teens had to do was live in it. Also a really great book, harder to show off because my copy is missing the dust jacket, but I highly recommend this book. These kids weren't consumed with fears about the draft or the civil rights movement or the Vietnam War. They were looking inwards and having existential crises about their place in the world and their future, which is a very different but no less important or valid fear. And it felt like no one was really speaking to those fears or validating their existence. Teen media has always been a thing, but for a long time it wasn't seen as an especially important market. And forget about variety or any semblance of emotional depth. 60s teen movies were usually just an excuse for a director to shoot a bunch of barely legal, and sometimes full-on illegal, girls in their underwear. I mean, I guess you had Bye Bye Birdie and West Side Story. But I don't know that two of the most overproduced musicals of all time are really a win for the 1960s. It was mostly a weird collection of vaguely misogynistic beach-themed rom-coms and anti-drug exploitation films. And the 70s were pretty much the exact same thing, but with more blood and screaming. There was no winning, especially if you were a teenage girl. You were either getting brutally murdered or cosplaying the 1950s and getting groped by John Travolta. Beach movies and slashers, that's really all you had to pick from if you were a young person growing up in the 60s and 70s. That and somewhat problematic musicals. But then the 1980s happened, and just like with music and fashion, we entered a golden age of filmmaking. A lot has been written about what makes 80s films stand out in the cultural zeitgeist, and once again, I'm going to recommend anybody who is interested in this subject to this book right here. This is Life Moves Pretty Fast by Hadley Freeman. She talks a lot about what makes films from this decade different from decades before and since, why they stand out in people's minds, how the filmmaking industry and the market has changed from decade to decade, all that good stuff that I don't really have the time or the interest to get into here. So if you want more of that, just go pick up this book. But suffice to say, filmmaking in the 80s and the importance of film in the 80s was something very new and different from what we had seen in the years before. Film was no longer just entertainment. It was a driving cultural force that mattered to society in the long run. And just like we saw with music during this decade, studios were taking bigger chances on new names, oddball stories, and other risky ventures. A lot of the films we love from the 80s would never have gotten made if they had been pitched in a different decade. And the first film in the John Hughes teen canon is a great example of that. 16 Candles, released in 1984, is not my favorite John Hughes film. But I'm not going to talk about that right now because regardless of how I feel about it, 16 Candles was the catalyst that got the coming-of-age craze ball rolling. Made with a $6.5 million budget, 16 Candles grossed over $23 million domestically, which was a surprising success when you consider what this movie is actually about and who it's marketed toward. This was a film that, looking at it from the outside, should not have been this industry-changing cultural reset. It's about a girl whose family is too busy planning her sister's wedding to remember her 16th birthday. That's pretty much it. Samantha Baker is the most normal, average girl in the world. There is nothing at all that makes her stand out from any random teenaged girl at the mall. A story that simple, and especially a story about a girl who doesn't take her clothes off or get stabbed to death, shouldn't have been interesting enough to keep people's attention, but that's exactly why it did. Remember, 80s teens weren't concerned with the fate of the world. They were concerned with being left behind and forgotten by a world they couldn't keep up with. They were preoccupied with the more mundane daily concerns of family and friendships and crushes on Michael Schaefling. For many teenagers in 1984, it was the first time they saw their life mirrored on the big screen. When we say representation matters, this is what we mean. People need media they can relate to, that understands them and sees them. And for the first time, here was a film that saw the most boring, average people around and didn't treat them like their problems were boring or stupid. Samantha Baker's birthday and whether she gets to make out with Jake Ryan are the biggest, most earth-shattering concerns in the world. Because that's how it feels to be a teenager. And in 16 Candles, these seemingly trivial concerns weren't treated like a joke for adults to laugh at. The teenage audiences saw this and appreciated it and connected with it. Actress Leah Thompson explains, John understood that at that time of your life, you feel things more deeply than you probably will ever feel them. And most adults don't want to remember that. They want to belittle that. Even inside, in their deepest recesses, they weren't making fun of it. After the proven success of 16 Candles, it didn't take much to convince audiences and distributors that John Hughes' work was something to take seriously. And perhaps the single most influential film in Hughes' canon came immediately after 16 Candles in 1985. The Breakfast Club is one of the greatest coming-of-age stories of all time, and it was really the film that proved to anyone still on the fence that stories about young people could be powerful, sincere, and important. The Breakfast Club was produced on a budget of just $1 million, but made nearly $52 million at the box office, and it was widely praised by audiences and critics alike. This film, more than any other, really spoke to the teenage experience at the time. But it also spoke to the adults who had survived these same emotional experiences during their own adolescence. Everyone who watched this film could relate to at least one of these characters' struggles, and oftentimes to multiple. While 16 Candles introduced the idea of grounded teen dramedy to audiences, The Breakfast Club cemented this genre and this director as the voice of a generation, and the film's financial and cultural success bolstered the release of the rest of Hughes' teen films and really got people to pay attention to what these movies had to say. Pretty in Pink followed in 1986, and its commentary on social and class division once again resonated with young audiences. The timeliness of Pretty in Pink and The Breakfast Club in particular cannot be overstated. I'm going to get deeper into the themes explored by these films in the next couple of sections. But an important part of understanding why they became such cultural touchstones is an understanding how relevant to the times these two particular films were. Ferris Bueller's Day Off wasn't far behind, and while it may have tipped more towards the fantastical comedy side than the rest of his film set, it still delivered the heart and emotional center that audiences had come to expect from Hughes, along with the catharsis of pent-up teen angst. Some Kind of Wonderful, directed by Howard Deutsch, may have been the lowest performing Hughes written film, grossing only $18.5 million, but its layered portrayal of class, gender, and social expectations was still deeply relevant to its target audience. There were also other, more grounded and practical reasons for the sudden and sustained popularity of these films. For one thing, the teen demographic in the 80s was suddenly a driving force in entertainment spending. With more women in the workforce, there were more two-income families, and more teenagers had access to spending money. They were also holding more after-school jobs in the decades that had come before them. Nearly 70% of American teenagers were in the workforce from 1981 to 1989. Teen spending dramatically increased between 1975 and 1985, even though the teen population decreased during those years, and their spending habits reflected what they most cared about and wanted to see. We also can't discount the importance of home video and its impact on the way people relate to media. VHS was invented in 1976, but wasn't a staple of most homes until the 80s, when its popularity exploded. Over 70% of American households owned a VCR in 1989. Being able to watch your favorite films over and over again whenever you wanted to on VHS was a relatively new concept. And I think the act of literally owning a story you love made teenagers feel like they metaphorically owned that story as well. They could revisit it anytime they wanted to, and actively living with the presence of a film you loved was a new feeling that probably had an impact whether people were aware of it or not. And when you consider that VHS tapes themselves weren't exactly inexpensive, if you owned a film, it was probably because you really loved it. So, what was so relatable about these films that made teenagers in the 80s love them so much? That's a question with a lot of different answers depending on who you ask. And as a side note, if you're interested in reading essays about those answers, I'm going to direct you to this book right here, Don't You Forget About Me, Contemporary Writers on the Films of John Hughes, edited by Jamie Clark. I referred to this book a lot when I was first mapping out this video, and I don't want to give away everything that's in the book, but it's a really great collection of diverse opinions and feelings about these movies that is really interesting and really eye-opening. It's also just a really pretty book. Like, look at the back, it looks like a VHS tape. I love that. No two teenage experiences are the same, and so no two people are going to have the same opinions and feelings about these movies. But there are a few common elements in most of the answers I've read that I think really stand out and can help us better understand the relevance of these films and what made them so relatable, not only to the teenagers of the 1980s, but to the young people of today. And they have to do with how we relate to each other, how we relate to the world, and most importantly, how we relate to ourselves. The first thing I want to discuss when it comes to the themes present in Hughes's work is how they discuss teenage relationships in all their forms. One of the many special things about these films is that they're never about just one type of relationship. There's usually a love interest, but there's also a strong focus on friendships and family dynamics, and they're usually given equal weight, something that is unfortunately rare in media made for young people, and media in general, if we're being completely honest. We're going to start by dissecting the most obvious low-hanging fruit, romantic relationships. The Hughes films are really interesting because they portray teenage romance in a surprisingly sincere and serious way. Sometimes these characters act in over-the-top, ridiculous ways, because that's how real teenagers under the influence of hormones act, but it never strays into the territory of denigrating those feelings. Their feelings are presented as valid, because to teenagers, hormonal insanity is the most valid thing in the world. But they also have a real sense of emotional maturity and weight to them. Take, for instance, the relationship between Andy and Blaine in Pretty in Pink. There's that sense of typical teenage yearning and drama, and they do blow up at each other the way teenagers do, but their arguments aren't really petty. They're about very real issues of social division. This is a period in life when young people are figuring out what matters to them, not only personally, but in their relationships. And it makes sense that they would argue about big picture things. We see the same kind of thing in Pretty in Pink's spiritual successor, Some Kind of Wonderful. Watts isn't just upset that the guy she likes is dating another girl. She's upset because of what she perceives as the kind of girl that Keith is dating. In most teen romantic dramas, the conflict is, let's admit it, usually something stupid. It's usually about jealousy or, well, that's really it. Writers love to portray teenagers as possessive, jealous brats, and they absolutely can be. Don't get me wrong. I think that's kind of a prerequisite for being a teenager. But I personally feel that more writers should lead by example and tell stories about romantic conflicts that don't involve jealousy or perceived cheating. The conflicts in these movies are more personal and far-reaching than that, and they actually involve issues of compatibility and worldview, things that teenagers, believe it or not, are actually concerned with. I think as we get older, we tend to view young people, and especially teenagers, as vapid and shallow. And I actually think that as we get older, our conflicts get more shallow, not less. I know a lot of adults who think less deeply about things than most teenagers. In my personal opinion, theory, whatever you want to call it, I think that's why a lot of writers forget to portray teenagers as having intelligent and mature conflicts, because they've grown out of it themselves. This is why I find the romance in Hughes' films to be genuinely enjoyable, despite not being a fan of romance stories myself, because they give these relationships the serious weight they deserve, and the characters at the center of these relationships are focused on more than just each other. They're worried about how their relationship with their significant other is going to affect their long term, whether they really see eye to eye on things or value the same ideas. And it isn't just their romantic relationships that are given this sense of gravity. A lot of importance is placed on the friendships in these movies, and sometimes the friendships are actually given more weight and development than the romances. This is something that I think is increasingly important in media for young people, and media for everyone, really. So much of the emphasis in youth media now is on romantic relationships. There aren't a lot of modern teen stories where platonic relationships drive the story, and I personally feel that's a very big problem. Not least of all because it can sometimes be the best way to meaningfully develop a character. The friendships we see in these films tell us a lot about how these characters see themselves and what they consider to be most important, and how these relationships shift over the course of each story tells us a lot about how these viewpoints change and how these characters grow. Take Some Kind of Wonderful, one of Hughes's most layered films. Amanda's social status is a point of contention for most of the movie because she's seen as being this popular, high-class girl, but it's only because she's managed to worm her way in with the rich kids. When she starts going out with Keith, her status drops significantly, and it affects her so-called friendships to the point where she loses most of her friends. These relationships and how Amanda reacts to them say more about her character growth than almost anything else we learn about her. But the Hughes film that says the most about friendship is also my personal favorite, and that's no coincidence. I love a good friendship story more than almost anything else, and at its heart, Ferris Bueller's Day Off is just that, a friendship story. Now, you've probably heard the film snob statement that Cameron Fry is actually the protagonist of Ferris Bueller's Day Off, but if you haven't heard it, I'm going to briefly explain it because it's actually true. In media analysis terms, the protagonist is not the main character, or the character you see the most of. It's the character who changes the most by the end of the story. And no matter how you look at it, that character in this movie is not Ferris, it's Cameron. Ferris is essentially the same person at the end of this movie as he was at the beginning. But Cameron goes through a lot of personal growth and change over the course of this one day. But why does he go through all of that change? Because of Ferris. Ferris is the catalyst for Cameron's change. Sure, we're led to believe that he only invited Cameron because he wanted the use of the car, but if you pay attention, you see that that's not really the case. Ferris does care deeply for Cameron and wants to snap him out of his helplessness and passivity. While Ferris is definitely the leader in that relationship, he obviously does love Cameron, and he is the entire reason that Cameron grows so much at the end of the film. And I'm not even talking about him convincing Cameron to play hooky and steal his father's prized car and run up the mileage. I'm talking about that scene at the end, where Cameron loses his shit and accidentally wrecks his father's car. Because for all his faults, for as irresponsible and reckless as he is, the first thing Ferris does when that happens is he jumps to take the fall for his best friend. And Ferris offering to sacrifice himself to the wrath of Cameron's father is what prompts Cameron to finally stand up for himself. It's easy to see Ferris as this somewhat selfish and immature character who is just using his friend throughout the movie. But his actions at the end of this movie tell us more about who Ferris really is than almost anything else we've seen up to this point. What Ferris values the most is his freedom, his independence. He values having fun and living in the moment and without consequences. And we see that he's willing to go to comically ridiculous lengths to keep that independence and avoid being caught. But when his best friend's well-being is on the line, all that freedom and independence just goes out the window, and we see that what Ferris really values the most is Cameron. It's really a very touching moment, and I think it's a great example of a non-romantic scene that tells us a lot about who a character really is. Another great scene in the Hughes canon that I want to touch on in this discussion is the scene between Samantha Baker and her dad in 16 Candles, for the way it uses a familial relationship to further a character who, up to this point, has been defined mostly by romance. 16 Candles is primarily a comedy, and it's kind of like Ferris Bueller in the way that, at first glance, it doesn't seem to have a whole lot of depth. The other films are dramas, but Ferris Bueller and 16 Candles are undeniably comedies first and foremost. So when you have a more serious scene, you're usually safe in assuming that that scene is the emotional turning point of the film. And in 16 Candles, the conversation between Sam and her dad, in my opinion, is that turning point. And it's the point when we see Sam at her most honest and vulnerable. Sam's relationship with her family is actually a very important part of this movie. Them forgetting her 16th birthday because they're too busy with her perfect older sister's wedding is what kicks off the whole movie and starts her feeling sorry for herself. In fact, I have this theory that that's why she got obsessed with Jake Ryan in the first place, because let's be honest, he's really not that worthy of obsession. Like, this is the most boring white boy I've ever seen. Caroline could have done so much better and honestly dodged a bullet with this one. But I can see how being noticed by an older, popular guy with a hot girlfriend might make Sam feel worthy of the attention her family has forgotten to give her. Anyway, my point is that it's actually this familial relationship that is the most important and formative part of Sam's character. So it makes sense that it's also her family that gives her that turning point moment. Sam is lying awake on the couch feeling sorry for herself when her dad, who's been totally ignoring her up until now, comes downstairs and apologizes for forgetting her birthday. And the two have a very sweet, very heartfelt conversation that is shockingly realistic and is my favorite part of a movie I consider to be pretty weak otherwise. Sam confides in her dad about her crush on Jake and how sad she is because he doesn't notice her and how she feels like an awkward dork. And her dad clumsily but very sincerely reassures her that she isn't a dork and that any guy who doesn't notice how great she is isn't worth her time. It's a very simple conversation, but it's actually the most brilliant part of this movie for a couple of reasons. First of all, Sam's whole thing is that she feels like no one notices her and she's not worthy of attention. But in this scene, her dad not only takes the time to apologize for hurting her feelings, he's paying enough attention to recognize that something else is bothering her. And sure, he misunderstands what it is at first, but he still notices that she's upset. Something that no one else has done over the course of this entire film. And the reason that's so important is that it lends even more weight to what he tells Sam about how a guy who doesn't notice her isn't worth crying over. This scene is what gives Sam her confidence back and helps her feel worthy of Jake's attention. Whether Jake's attention is worth all that nonsense is a different argument. But anyway, my point is that the relationship between Sam and her father is actually the most important in the film because it's the one that gives us the turning point. Romantic relationships aren't always the catalyst for change in these films. And that's an increasingly rare and important thing in stories made for and about this demographic. The last type of relationship I want to talk about in this series of films is the relationship of the characters to themselves. This is the one that by far is the hardest to portray in a meaningful and relatable way. But it's also the one that, if done well, elevates a film from a simple teen movie to a timeless classic that really speaks to and understands its audience and is able to transcend that generational barrier. And the best film to exemplify that theme is, of course, The Breakfast Club. Now, I think all of Hughes's teen films do this relationship to self theme very, very well, exceptionally well in the realm of teen media. And like I touched on before, I think that's a big reason of why they're so beloved and so iconic. But The Breakfast Club really stands out because the outward relationships, the relationships between family, friends, and romantic partners, aren't really present in that movie. Sure, you learn about some of the characters' relationships to their families and friends, and there are hints of budding romantic relationships between some of them, but they're not a central part of that film's theme or plot. Pretty in Pink and Some Kind of Wonderful have plots that revolve around romance. Ferris Bueller is a friendship story. 16 Candles is about family. But The Breakfast Club isn't really about any of those things. This movie is about how these characters see each other, sure, but it's more so about how these characters see themselves, and how they're all struggling to figure out who they are in a world that is aggressively telling each of them what it wants them to be. The biggest scene in The Breakfast Club is undeniably the part where they're all sitting in a circle of teen angst and discussing their problems. It's not only the part where we get the most amount of backstory for each of them, it's also the part where they're the most honest with each other and with themselves. We see how each of these characters views the people they're stuck in detention with, and we see how those views change over the course of their conversation. And as their view of each other changes, they start seeing themselves differently as well. After this scene, they each leave with a better understanding of themselves as individuals than they had when they entered that circle. What I find most interesting about this theme being the most prevalent part of The Breakfast Club is that we take this being the thesis of that film very much for granted nowadays. Like, when you talk to someone about The Breakfast Club, it's just kind of a given that it was a deeper, darker movie than you thought it was going to be, and that's why it's good. But when Hughes first pitched this film to Universal, they didn't want to make it, because they thought it was too dark and too serious and wouldn't keep the interest of its teenage audience. In fact, that's why the initial trailers cut it as a comedy, and why it's sometimes marked as one, despite very obviously not being one. Clearly, the executives at Universal were wrong, as they often are, because The Breakfast Club remains the most highly regarded and influential of all of John Hughes's works. According to Ned Tannen, former president of production at Universal Pictures, that movie spoke to a generation more than any other movie in that decade. And the reason for that is because of the way it examines that relationship to self, in a decade where outside social forces were forcing people, and especially teenagers, to examine themselves and figure out how they related to the world and each other. And it's that examination of our relationship to the world around us that I want to talk about next. Because the social atmosphere of the 1980s really impacted these films and their individual messages in ways that are shockingly timely and relevant even today. One of the things that has always fascinated me the most about the 1980s is the way that so many cultural attitudes were shifting and changing and intersecting. A lot of 80s media, not just movies, but TV and music, was a reaction to and focused on those changes. And the Hughes films can not only tell us so much about the prevailing culture of the decade, but a lot about the way young people were reacting to and living within that culture. The first and possibly most prevalent cultural theme in Hughes's work I want to discuss is the class divide. Now, class has always been one of the biggest issues in American culture. I would argue more than race, more than gender, more than sexuality, more than anything else. Class is what drives the cultural divide in America. And something interesting I've noticed about a lot of 80s films is what a driving force the idea of class is. You see it in the background of so many iconic 80s movies, whether it's a primary plot point or not. And because class is such a huge issue in America, this isn't really anything novel. Like, class is a major theme, I would say, in most of the most iconic films from any decade. But films from the 80s were more in your face about it. And what's really interesting is that teen films were very explicit in their portrayal of class. You don't really see the class divide in a lot of youth media today. Like, it might be there in the background somewhere if you really look for it, but except for, like, The Hunger Games, it's not really a major theme in teen media today. Now, there is a reason that stories about class have largely dried up in American popular media. It's a dumb reason, but it makes a strange, dumb sort of sense. The film industry today is very concerned with the international market, which sucks for a number of reasons and is, in my opinion, why we've had so many stinkers lately that have nothing important to say. But that's a different topic for a different day. Basically, the film industry today is more concerned with telling a simple story that can reach a large international market than it is with telling specific stories that will only relate to an American culture, if that makes sense. Film lecturer James Russell explains the recent decline of class stories in Hadley Freeman's Life Moves Pretty Fast. You can't sell a movie to Japan or China that is about specific American culture issues. So while American movies are still set in America, they are much vaguer and certainly not about American social issues. Also, it tended to be mid-budget films that dealt with social issues in the 80s, and Hollywood doesn't make films with those budgets anymore. It makes big blockbusters or low-budget independents. So the popularity of stories about class in the 80s was born out of a rare moment when the market was temporarily supporting the telling of those stories and allowing it to happen. And that's something we just don't see anymore. And like I said already, the difference is especially stark when you compare modern teen blockbusters to the teen films of the 1980s. I mean, most films for teenagers from that decade were about the class divide. Besides the obvious John Hughes entries, films like Can't Buy Me Love, Valley Girl, The Outsiders, Heathers, Flashdance, they're all very much about the socioeconomic clash, and even films that didn't focus on it didn't hide it. And the prevalence of class consciousness in films, and especially films marketed to young people, is especially striking considering the cultural conservatism of Reagan's America. Art was saying what the people weren't. And the fact that it was largely art for and about young people saying it is really fascinating to me. Hughes's films are very focused on issues of class, and that's no coincidence. Hughes was raised in a modest, average household in a wealthy area of Chicago, and his feelings of inadequacy growing up really come through in these films. He definitely has a finger on the pulse of lower middle-class suburbia, and he portrays it with a real sense of sincerity. The most obvious films to discuss here are, of course, Pretty in Pink and Some Kind of Wonderful, and especially Pretty in Pink. In fact, one of the biggest controversies involving the Hughes 80s canon can be explained and defended by looking at it through the lens of class commentary. As most people watching this video probably know, but I'm going to explain it anyway, Pretty in Pink has the unfortunate distinction of having one of the most divisive endings in any teen film. The movie follows Andy, a poor girl who falls in love with Blaine, a rich guy, and all the class-driven drama that ensues from that relationship. Andy has a best friend, Ducky, who is deeply in love with her. It's a pretty loose love triangle as far as love triangles go. Like, the ending really shouldn't be as shocking as people make it out to be. Anyway, in the official cut of the movie, Andy ends up with Blaine. But in the original version that was shown to test audiences, she breaks up with Blaine and ends up with Ducky. And the test audiences famously hated this ending, so much so that they rushed to reshoot the ending of the film to make Andy get back together with Blaine. This is actually why Blaine's hair looks so bad at the end of the movie. McCarthy had to cut his hair for another film and is wearing a bad wig. So these two endings absolutely split the 80s film fandom. People will go to war over Ducky being the correct choice, but I think there are a couple of things here that people forget to consider. Audiences hated the Ducky ending for a reason. Actually, several reasons, some of which made more sense than others. One of the reasons people gave was they thought Ducky was gay, which, I mean, yeah, I kind of see that. But I think there are other reasons that the target audience may not even have been cognizant of at the time. Remember, the audience was made up of teenagers, and especially teenage girls. I'm going to get more into the gender dynamics of the Hughes canon in the next section, but this is an important viewpoint to consider because Pretty in Pink is an aspirational film. Teenage girls wanted Andy to end up with Blaine for any number of reasons, and I think one of the most interesting takes on this issue was put forward by cultural historian Neil Gabler, which can be found in Susanna Gora's You Couldn't Ignore Me If You Tried. As far back as the screwball comedies popular during the Great Depression, when there was all this class tension and class hostility, romantic comedies took a partner from each class and put them together, and unified America. Gabler sees a parallel between the romantic comedies uniting the classes in the 1930s and the teen films doing so in the 80s, such as Pretty in Pink. The 80s saw a dramatic divide between the wealthy and the poor, says Gabler, and I think that, intuitively, the Hughes movies are addressing that increasing divide. Everything is a signifier of class when you're a teenager. So what Hughes was doing in using teenagers to address class issues at a time when class was increasingly important in America, there was a certain kind of brilliance in it. So while I would have chosen Ducky, I can understand how throwing away the class reconciliation shown by Andy choosing Blaine would have felt wrong to teenagers in the 80s who were navigating the class divide. That need for hope and optimism in the face of increasing socioeconomic division is important to consider when we talk about Pretty in Pink and its successor, Some Kind of Wonderful, and how audiences reacted to them, and especially their dislike of the Ducky ending. And I actually think that Pretty in Pink is a stronger film for the official ending, and that Blaine was the right choice for a number of reasons. But one of the strongest being that it tells an optimistic and timely story of class reconciliation. Some Kind of Wonderful, I think, is focused more on gender expectations than on class, but it does touch on the class divide in the story of Amanda, who I talked a little bit about earlier. Amanda isn't rich, but she looks rich, and she carries herself as if she is, which allows her a certain amount of popularity among the kids who actually are wealthier. But when she defies the expectations placed on her by going out with Keith, who is actually closer to her in socioeconomic status, she loses the respect of all her friends and has to contend with the hurtful realization of just how much class matters. There's another Hughes film that has a lot to say about class, and it's probably not one that comes readily to mind. Ferris Bueller's Day Off is really interesting because these kids are wealthy, far wealthier than any of Hughes's other characters, and it shows. As I think I said earlier, Ferris Bueller is very much a fantasy. It's what kids want their life to look like. And that includes the trappings of casual wealth that we see throughout the film. But what I find interesting is that it turns that fantasy on its head in the last act of the film with Cameron's monologue about his father. We know that Cameron's family is wealthy, wealthier even than the Buellers. I mean, his dad has this entire detached glass-windowed garage with a bunch of expensive cars that he never drives or even turns on, just rubs with a diaper. But we see that that status doesn't come without a price, and that price is his son, Cameron, and his mental and emotional well-being. We know Cameron's father is a point of upset in his life, but it takes a very careful watch and reading between the lines to really see just how toxic this relationship is and how influenced it is by the need for status. His father totally ignores his wife and child and seems to care more for appearances and influence than he does his family. And while you see signs throughout the film that this is the case, it isn't until Cameron's breakdown that you really see just how much Hughes had to say on the subject of wealth and forgotten kids. I don't know how much I can show here without getting copyright struck, so if I have to cut most of the monologue, it's up in several places on YouTube. But Cameron sums it up really well if you just listen very closely to this monologue, which, incidentally, is one of the best monologues I think I've ever heard.
I gotta take a stand. I gotta take a stand against him. I am not gonna sit on my ass. As the events that affect me unfold to determine the course of my life, I'm gonna take a stand. Right or wrong, I'm gonna defend him. I'm so sick of his shit. I can't stand him, and I hate this goddamn car. Who do you love? Who do you love? You love a car. Good. He'll come home, he'll see what I did, he'll have to deal with me. I'm just tired of being afraid. Hell with him.
For a generation that was largely defined by both economic booms and crashes, the themes of class in Hughes' films served as a mirror to their experiences with class division. While it didn't always necessarily tie up these issues in a neat little pink prom dress colored bow, it did deliver the comfort of knowing that they weren't alone in worrying about these issues and realistically portrayed situations they would possibly have to navigate themselves one day. And for a generation of teenage girls, the 80s Hughes canon delivered something else. Dignity and empowerment in a world that was becoming increasingly hostile to the experiences of women. Something else I find fascinating about 80s media is that it often defies what you would expect from a decade that didn't seem to like women very much. Feminism wasn't exactly popular in the 80s. In fact, it was very unpopular. Women in the workforce, won't someone think of the children, blah, blah, blah. But what's so weird is that a lot of 80s films are shockingly feminist for the era they came out in. Much like with issues of class, in the age of the moral majority, art was saying what the people wouldn't or couldn't. And once again, a lot of that feminist art was made for young people. Now, obviously, there are a lot of misogynistic 80s teen films. Don't get me started on Porky's, Revenge of the Nerds, and to a lesser extent, yes, Weird Science. But when it comes to the core 5 films we're discussing in this video, honestly, they were kind of groundbreaking in terms of gender. The John Hughes films of the 80s have a shockingly large number of strong, intelligent, and independent female characters, which is really surprising for the culture and even more surprising considering these were movies written and largely directed by men. While there are some definite slip-ups that we will be discussing later, for the most part, the young women in these movies are realistic, strong, and incredibly well written, which was new, to say the least. As I talked about a little bit in the beginning of this video, it wasn't always great to be a female character in a movie, because most movies, and especially movies for young people, weren't for or about women. Teen movies in the 50s focused primarily on young men, and women were just secondary characters or plot devices used to further a man's story. The 60s were having a blast exploiting the sexual revolution by objectifying young female actresses. And the 70s was the age of the horror film, where if you were anything but a chaste and pure virgin dedicated to great babysitting service, you were going to get brutalized and murdered by a guy in a William Shatner mask. You could be a strong final girl, but only if you followed the patriarchy's rules. Hollywood has never liked women, and it especially hates teenage girls. And it especially hates teenage girls who don't fit the archetype of the perfect male fantasy. Awkward or outcast teenage boys were a common archetype in films from every era, and they were often the underdog heroes. But loving portrayals of awkward teenage girls were very few and far between. Even normal, everyday girls weren't especially common characters, since most stories revolved around men, and the women in those films were romantic subplots for those men, so they had to conform to the ideal male fantasy. Film producer Linda Obst, puts it very well when she says, when people talked about the teen market, they meant the male teen market. Teenage girls just weren't considered important enough to market to. So until Hughes came along and started writing characters such as Andy Walsh and Samantha Baker, girls didn't often see themselves portrayed in meaningful ways. As Molly Ringwald puts it, there had been movies with strong female protagonists before, but not ones with strong female teenage protagonists. So when 16 Candles came on the scene and told a story about an average teenage girl from that girl's perspective and treated her concerns and her experiences with the same gravity Hollywood had been giving teenage boys' experiences for decades, girls paid attention. And that point about them being average teenage girls is very important. Even today, we don't see a lot of stories about normal, boring teenage girls because girls still have to be exceptional or different in some way in order for their stories to be seen as important. See the manic pixie dream girl trope. But however awkward they may seem to an audience uninformed as to the teen girl experience, the Hughes girls aren't manic pixie dream girls. They are normal girls who only seem quirky and different because of the societal context surrounding them. They're really very average teen girls to anyone who has ever been a teenage girl. I think Andy in Pretty in Pink is a perfect example of this. She dresses like a maniac, not because she's a maniac, but because teenage girls dress like maniacs. That prom dress is ugly as hell, and everyone knows it, but it makes sense because teenage girls have crazy ideas about fashion. When I was a young teenager, I wore chunky owl necklaces from Charming Charlie and was obsessed with the color chartreuse. Teenagers don't know how to dress, so that prom dress was actually very accurate as to what a girl obsessed with DIY would think looked good. Anyway, my point is that these girls are never over-the-top quirky because they don't need to be. They're meant to be realistic and aren't written for the male gaze, which is incredibly rare even today. Which leads me to one of the things that strikes me the most about the Hughes girls, and that is how diverse they are in their expressions of girlhood. Some of them are classically feminine, while others, like Watts and Some Kind of Wonderful, are androgynous, bordering on masculine, and everything in between. And none of these are ever treated as lesser ways to express femininity, or not express it. Watts is an especially interesting character because while other characters in the film do judge her for her masculinity, the heroes of the story don't. Keith likes her for who she is and eventually even loves her for who she is, and even classically feminine Amanda treats her with respect. Watts doesn't change herself for a man and gets the man anyway, and she's not the only one. In Pretty in Pink, every male character is forced to undergo some sort of big personal change. But Andy doesn't, and still gets to be with Blaine in the end and have everything she wanted. Another reason the Blaine ending was actually the right choice, story-wise. As Hadley Freeman said regarding the ending of that movie in particular, why shouldn't the awkward girl get the beautiful boy? In a society where rigid expectations of gender presentation are so prevalent, girls winning on their own terms is a unique and beautiful thing to portray. Even in situations where a girl does undergo some sort of big physical or personal change, it doesn't destroy the essence of who that girl is and what makes her special. And yes, I'm talking about the makeover scene in The Breakfast Club. Now look, I get it. I hate makeover scenes. As someone who grew up looking and feeling like the before in every makeover scene, I hate makeover scenes. I will probably do an entire video one day just talking about the weird prevalence of these scenes in films from the 90s and 2000s and how they have ruined the self-image of scores of young girls from my generation. I despise them with every fiber of my glasses-wearing, badly dressed being. But I don't hate the makeover scene in The Breakfast Club, and I think it's one of the most misunderstood scenes in any film. So in The Breakfast Club, during the last act of the film, the princess, Molly Ringwald's Claire Standish, gives a makeover to the basket case, the ethereal Ally Sheedy's Allison Reynolds. She gives her this horrible hairband bow thing and generally makes her look like she just got out of a Southern Baptist prayer meeting. And a lot of people really despise this scene and say it ruined the film's message, and I get it. I totally get where they're coming from. But I strongly disagree because this is not a classic, stereotypical makeover scene. This scene between Claire and Allison comes about not because Claire is trying to change Allison into someone she's not or help her get a guy. The only goal here is to have these two female characters from totally different worlds connect through a classic staple of female bonding. Makeovers are a pretty common thing that girls do with each other. And without the misogynistic context that most films nowadays give them, they're really totally wholesome. Sure, Andy did that whole thing where he gets all flustered by Allison when he sees her in her American Girl doll getup, but he already liked Allison. In fact, it's pretty obvious to me, at least, that he only had this reaction because he was finally seeing her face for the first time, not because she was wearing a pink bow. And speaking of seeing Allison's face, that's kind of the point of the whole scene. The brilliant Ally Sheedy didn't like the original direction this scene was originally scripted to take, and Sheedy asked if they could remove Allison's dark makeup rather than adding makeup on. Says Sheedy, I asked John, can we make it more that they are taking the shell off of her? And if you watch the scene objectively, that's exactly what happens. This last act of the film is all about the characters seeing each other for who they truly are and changing in some way. And with Allison, it takes a very literal form. Allison's makeup and hair are less about self-expression in The Breakfast Club than they are about hiding and trying to be invisible. And her transformation in the makeover is more closely tied to the emotional transformation they all go through at this stage in the film to a physical one. Basically, my point here is that these films are very unique in teen media because the girls aren't expected to change for men to get their happy endings. And as long as we're talking about gender dynamics, the boys in these films are also something pretty special. I think when we discuss gender and feminism in media, we often forget that it's not just about portraying women well, it's also about portraying good men. And in this case, good teenage boys. With a few exceptions, who, again, I'm gonna rag on here in a little bit. When I watch the Hughes films, I'm always pleasantly surprised at the sensitive treatment of teenage boys and how to be a good man. The boys in these films are emotionally complex, sensitive, and caring. Keith, in Some Kind of Wonderful, is a talented artist who clashes with his father over his traditional expectations of a man and doesn't let that change him. As I already discussed, Ferris Bueller is a genuinely caring friend who spends the whole movie trying to bring Cameron out of his shell and show him a good time, and is ultimately willing to put himself in the line of fire for his best friend. The love interests treat their female counterparts with dignity and respect, which seems like the bare minimum, but don't forget that in other popular teen films such as Grease, male protagonists were assaulting their female counterparts and still called the heroes in the end. The Hughes love interests, on the other hand, are what most girls are actually attracted to, rather than what men like to think they're attracted to. They're more concerned with being kind and emotionally mature than they are with being macho and wearing lots of leather. Something else that really strikes me is the way that the Hughes films portray and discuss toxic masculinity without even meaning to, in an era before the phrase was even known or understood by the general public. Villains such as the gleefully evil Steph in Pretty in Pink, portrayed by everyone's favorite Lizard King, James Spader, and the less memorable but possibly even more sleazy Hardy Jens in Some Kind of Wonderful, are pretty explicitly depicted as being threatened and triggered by strong women asserting their independence. Steph and Hardy are very obvious manifestations of male insecurity in the face of female strength, and they're rightfully called out for it. Even the good guys in these movies learn how to face and contend with toxic masculinity, with The Breakfast Club being possibly the best example of this. John Bender may act tough, uncontrollable, and unbothered by authority, but inside he's really just a frightened kid covering up his fear and lack of control with what he views as strength, which is aggression and cruelty. Andy is in detention for what at first is presented to the audience as a boys will be boys prank, but as he talks more about what happened, we see that he's actually pretty bothered by his own terrible actions and the need to impress his father, who wants him to be more of a man. I think these two characters in particular really speak to the uniquely male experience of feeling the need to act cruel or tough in order to be seen as worthy of respect. That's an incredibly important message and conversation for young men, and it's really quite impressive that a film that is now 40 years old managed to do it in a more sincere and natural way than almost anything that has come along since. I think the level of respect that Hughes gave the experiences of both young women and young men is just one more reason these films speak to people across the generational divide, and a big reason of why they continue to be so influential and so meaningful. Even during an era of extremely problematic portrayals of gender dynamics, they managed to bring feminist themes and discussions to a wider audience without that audience even realizing it was happening. But all this isn't to say that these films are perfect. If we're going to dissect them this deeply, we also need to take a look at the parts that we maybe don't want to see, and talk about why and how we should view the less timeless elements of our favorite films. Before I really get into this final section, I want to make it clear that this is not an indictment of the Hughes films, or really any film that maybe hasn't aged very well. It was a different time isn't a great excuse for racism or misogyny, but it is an explanation. And it can be a valid one to help us remember to do better than those who came before and to learn from their mistakes. As we've already discussed, these films were really groundbreaking in a lot of ways. They showed young people, and young women especially, as independent, intelligent, and interesting, and made them the heroes of their own stories in ways that were relatable to a lot of young people. But this was the 80s. They weren't exactly what I would call diverse, or racially sensitive in any way. And there are some deeply insensitive and troubling jokes made about sexual assault, especially in 16 Candles. There's a reason that's my least favorite of these films. I think it exemplifies the things beloved 80s films were most guilty of when it comes to problematic humor. Which brings me to the first point I want to make here, and that is that these problems are not exclusive to these films. The 80s were a great time for film. Some of the best and most iconic movies ever made are from this decade, but I don't think there's a person alive over the age of 30 who hasn't watched one of their childhood favorites and cringed as they suddenly realized just how messed up some of these movies were. Like, don't Google what happened with Principal Rooney in 2002. Talk about aging badly. While I wouldn't necessarily call all the humor in 80s movies malicious, there's a lot of racism, both intentional and unintentional, and a lot of misogyny and ableism. The misogyny is something I find especially troubling and especially interesting when we talk about John Hughes. Obviously, the racism is also bad. Don't get me wrong. But to be fair, there's really only that one big elephant in the room with 16 Candles and Long Duck Dong. Like, people of color aren't really portrayed badly in these films, except for that one instance. They're just not really portrayed at all. And to be honest, I think we have to give Hughes some grace for that. He's a white boomer who grew up in the suburbs. Would you really trust this guy to tell a black coming-of-age story? Because I wouldn't. I think we all know that would not have ended well, and this segment would be a lot less forgiving. Honestly, I think it's kind of a good thing that there aren't a lot of people of color in these movies, because we all saw 16 Candles. Also, if I had a nickel for every time I discussed Gere Watanabe's problematic 80s roles in a video that isn't about that, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. Like, why is Mr. Watanabe haunting my channel? It's like I've been cursed by Long Duck Dong and I'm not even Asian. Anyway, the racism is bad, yes, but the misogyny is what I find truly interesting, because as we've already discussed, these films were so unexpectedly feminist. They really portrayed girlhood with sensitivity and understanding. So it's especially upsetting that the same director who gave us the incredible It's a Trap virginity discussion in The Breakfast Club also gave us Jake Ryan, a love interest who hands his blackout drunk girlfriend off to another guy for the evening and gives us this exchange.
I can get a piece of ass anytime I want. Shit, I got Caroline in the bedroom right now, passed out cold. Violate her 10 different ways if I wanted to.
What are you waiting for?
I don't know. She's beautiful and she's built and all that. I'm just not interested anymore.
And he's supposed to be the guy our protagonist Sam, and by extension the young female audience, has the hots for. It's things like this, and things like Long Duck Dong, and things like the panty shot in The Breakfast Club, and good guys saying slurs and Pretty in Pink that we now have to come to terms with in an age where it's no longer acceptable. So how do we do that? The truth is, I don't have a solid, concrete answer, because I think it's different for every person, and I think that's okay. For me, it's about taking the good from the bad, while not ignoring that the bad exists. When I watch films like The Breakfast Club or Pretty in Pink, films that I love but that have parts that are harmful, I have to remind myself that people are not entirely angelic or evil. We all make mistakes, and that goes for characters and it goes for the artists who create those characters. Writers make mistakes, directors make mistakes, filmmakers make mistakes. And they don't always learn from them or change their ways, but that doesn't mean that we can't. Recognizing when something is wrong or hurtful and why is important so that we don't make those same mistakes and we don't cause that same harm. I actually think that sometimes the badly aged humor in 80s films can be a positive thing, because it's much easier to have discussions about difficult topics like this when they're in movies that everyone has seen and everyone recognizes and likes. For example, most people would hopefully agree that blackface is wrong and horrible, which is why it's mostly died out in mainstream media. Like, people agree, blackface is always wrong, full stop. But there's a fair amount of people out there who still laugh at Caroline's plight in 16 Candles. And I think this kind of thing existing in a movie that is otherwise mostly wholesome and harmless actually makes that discussion easier and more accessible. It's a lot easier to show someone the prevalence of rape culture and explain what it is when it's in such a beloved mainstream film. Like, yeah, it sucks that it was ever a joke to begin with. But it being a joke in a movie most everyone loves makes the entire concept of popular misogyny much easier to explain to someone who denies its very existence. Because these films are so popular and so mainstream, it's easier for us to look at the problematic parts and really understand just how widespread and easily accepted racist and misogynistic humor really was and still is. You expect to see this sort of stuff on the fringes. You don't expect it to see in the movie that you wore out on the VCR as a teenager. And when we're confronted with it, we realize how easy it was for us to watch it and laugh at it and accept it. Until we learned why it was wrong, and that's a very important lesson to learn. Learning to be better doesn't always take the form of a sexist jerk getting his comeuppance. Sometimes it's recognizing that your teenage movie crush and the hero of the story was actually a real loser who no woman is safe with. And I think learning to recognize the insidiousness beneath the wholesome veneer is just as important, if not more so, than just having the badness spelled out for you. And of course, not everyone feels this way. There are plenty of films that I also will not watch and will not acknowledge because I feel that they contributed so much harm that they aren't redeemable in any way. Rain Man! But what we consider redeemable is different for every person. And it's not up to us to tell someone else what stories they are and are not allowed to resonate with. If a story speaks to you, no one else gets to tell you that it shouldn't. So I guess my final point here is that the lessons in these films are what you make of them. They speak to people for a reason, and if they speak to you, that's all that really matters. So yes, learn to recognize and face the problematic elements. But also remember that it's what you chose to learn from them that matters the most. Wow, that was an incredibly long video for something that is basically just an intro to this last segment. The original concept for this video was a ranking of the John Hughes 80s teen films. Like, that's what I pitched it as, that's what you voted for in the poll. And I would be greatly remiss if I didn't give the people what they want. Or what they said they wanted. I kind of get the feeling what y'all really want is more Weird Al content, which, more than fair, stay tuned, it's coming. But anyway, I promised a ranking of these films, and now I'm going to deliver. A quick note, with the exception of number 5, I adore all of these movies. So even the ones ranked lower, I still consider some of my favorite movies of all time. Ranking these is incredibly difficult because I love them all so much. So please don't come for me when my ranking does not align with yours because it's a little bit controversial. So, without further ado, at number 5, big shock, it's 16 Candles. I'm sorry, I just don't like this movie. There are parts I think are genuinely touching and heartfelt. I love the scene between Sam and her dad, but most of it is just vaguely uncomfortable. Long Duck Dong loses like 2 out of 5 stars on his own, and the way Caroline is treated brings it down another star for me. I personally don't relate to Sam. I think that Farmer Ted is a creep. Even if Anthony Michael Hall is the only person on Earth who could have made that character bearable, and he actually kind of saves the role. And Jake Ryan is the most overrated piece of white bread since John Travolta. I'm sorry, I'm sure that Michael Schaefling is a very nice person, but look, I have a type, and it's not this. I do laugh at some parts. I think there's a good movie somewhere in there. It's just not whatever this was. I'm sorry. I know that's blasphemy, but it's bottom of the list for me. Moving on. Number 4 is Some Kind of Wonderful. Now, here's the thing about Some Kind of Wonderful. I actually really like this movie. Like, after that last place, nothing else on this list is really last. It's just, like, I liked some movies more than others. I don't dislike any of the rest of these movies at all. Some Kind of Wonderful is actually really good and very underrated. It's just at number 4 because I didn't like it as much as the rest of the other movies on this list. I don't find it as memorable. Like, this one was kind of made to be a redo of Pretty in Pink, and I think Pretty in Pink is better. However, there is one thing I have to mention about this movie. When I watched it for the first time, I spent the entire movie live texting my best friend about how it was clearly a thinly veiled lesbian love story between Amanda and Watts. And I'm dead serious. How dead serious? Serious enough that I'm going to make an exclusive video on my Patreon explaining this theory. I'm not joking. My first Patreon exclusive video is going to be explaining my theory about why Some Kind of Wonderful is actually gay. It's going up on Patreon mostly because I have to use a lot of clips to make my point, and I don't trust YouTube not to, strike me dead. It'll be available under the $5 tier. Don't worry. I'm not gonna make you join the Severus fan club just to hear me explain my fan theory about a 40-year-old teen flick. Anyway, number 4 is Some Kind of Wonderful. Number 3 and number 2 drove me nuts when I was writing this segment because I could not decide which was which. I love both of these movies for very different reasons. And they were so closely tied that I even considered not separating their rank at all and just ranking them as the same thing. But I know that's cheating. So I really thought about it, and finally I was like, okay, to settle this, which of these movies do I enjoy watching more? And using that criteria, I decided that number 3 is The Breakfast Club. So from a critical standpoint, I actually think The Breakfast Club is the best of all of these films. Like, if I was ranking them critically, from a critic's perspective, I would rank The Breakfast Club as number 1. It's the deepest, the smartest, the most ambitious. I think it's just a masterpiece all around. But as a personal ranking, it's number 3. Like, if it's a Friday night, and I want to watch a movie, and I don't have UHF handy, and all I have to pick from is Pretty in Pink and The Breakfast Club, I'm gonna go with Pretty in Pink. I know this sounds crazy, but I don't really like the characters in The Breakfast Club as much as I do the others. I love Brian. Like, Brian's never done anything wrong in his entire life, and everyone knows I would die for Ali Sheedy. But everyone else just kind of sucks, and I'm not as invested in these characters as I am those in Pretty in Pink. So, number 3, The Breakfast Club. Which obviously makes number 2, Pretty in Pink. This is not everyone's favorite, and I get that, and I don't care. Everything about this movie speaks to me. It has the best, popular music film soundtrack of any John Hughes film, possibly any film ever. Like, that cover of Wouldn't It Be Good is just beautiful. I love the aesthetic. I love Andy's terrible fashion sense. I love Ducky's terrible fashion sense. I love Andy as a protagonist. I love all these characters. I even like Blaine. But I love Andy. I think Andy is a great example of how to write a quirky, kind of weird teenage girl protagonist without making her cringeworthy. Like, she's very realistic. She feels very grounded, but at the same time, she's weird. I mean, she's a weird girl, but she's a likable weird. I like Blaine. I know Blaine is, he's a piece of white toast, but I think he's a good character, and he really grows over the course of the film, and I like that. And I love Ducky. I'm sure that goes without saying. Anyone who has been paying attention sees I've got my little Ducky back here. What, Sev? Okay, well, Sev is saying that he likes Ducky too. I don't know if my microphone picked that up. Anyway, before Severus interrupted me, I love Ducky. Ducky matches my energy. I was actually going to dress as Ducky for this video, but I tried it. It was just too hot. It was too many layers. So instead I'm channeling a very weak Ferris Bueller instead. But Ducky, I love Ducky. I love that this movie is so firmly about a weird girl learning who she is in the world and getting a happy ending. And I love everything about it. Pretty in Pink is one of those films that isn't everyone's favorite in the Hughes canon, so if it's one of your favorites, it's like it's really your favorite. Except for number one, of course. And number one, of course, is my favorite John Hughes film of all time, of all of his films from any decade, Ferris Bueller's Day Off. I mean, you probably figured that out from process of elimination. There's only 5 movies on this list. It's not that hard. But if you're still here, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, truly a masterpiece. I talked about this earlier, but what I love about Ferris Bueller's Day Off is that at its heart, it's a friendship story. Friendship stories are always going to be my very favorite, and I think this is a really good one. The relationship between Cameron and Ferris is the heart of this film, and seeing how it changes both of them for the better is just beautiful. Y'all also know I love comedy as an art form, and so a comedy film, it was always going to be number one. And especially a heartfelt comedy film that has so much to say and says it so well. This is a movie about freedom, about independence, about growing up and finding what's most important to you, and about friendship. I'd always heard it said from like other 80s movie buffs that you're either a Cameron or you're a Ferris. And I think that's true to an extent, but I also think that there's a little bit of Cameron and a little bit of Ferris in everyone. And this movie, it really does a good job of showing how important and needed that balance is. It was a fight for the number 2 and 3 positions, more or less, but number 1, no contest. It was always going to be Ferris Bueller's Day Off. So there you go. After an hour, more than an hour. I don't actually know what the runtime of this is going to be because I'm filming it right now. But after a very long video, you finally get the ranking that you voted for. Please leave me your rankings in the comments. I would love to see them. I would love to see your reasoning for them. And I would love to tell you how wrong you are. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. All of your opinions are completely valid. You're only wrong if you put Ferris Bueller lower than number 3. Am I done now? My God, that was a long video. If you made it all the way here, congratulations, because I almost didn't. This video is the culmination of months of reading and researching and writing notes. You want to see just how much reading and research? These are the books that I pulled from, and I really want to credit them properly because they were invaluable. First is You Couldn't Ignore Me If You Tried, John Hughes, The Brat Pack, and Their Impact on a Generation by Susanna Gora. Once again, I know there's not a whole lot to look at here. I got my copy off of Thrift Books. It was between a $12 copy that was like in good condition and a $4 copy that was in acceptable condition. So I got the acceptable one, and the only thing wrong with it is that it has no dust jacket. And I'm sorry, but the dust jacket is actually really ugly. So yeah, I'm fine with this copy. Anyway, this book is possibly the most complete history of the production history of the John Hughes films, the Brat Pack, like the group of actors who were in these movies, along with several other iconic 80s teen films, and all of the drama that happened with that whole thing. So it also includes chapters on the other Brat Pack films, Say Anything and St. Elmo's Fire. And in general, it's just a great look at this period in film history and the people who created it and the impact it had. It is kind of hard to find. Like I said, I got my copy off of Thrift Books, which was fine with me because I highlighted it all to hell. But yes, highly recommend this book. The next one I want to recommend is Don't You Forget About Me, Contemporary Writers on the Films of John Hughes, edited by Jamie Clark. So this is a collection of essays from writers and artists who grew up with the John Hughes films and, their thoughts on them, the impact these films had on their work and their relevance. It's a very interesting collection of essays. This was really helpful for me as someone who came to these films long after their original, decade of release. I was not a teenager in the 80s, but I saw these films as a teenager in the 2000s. So this was really helpful in helping me to understand why these films were so important, why people connected with them. It's very eye-opening. It'll leave you really looking at these movies in a whole new way and seeing a side of them that you may not have thought about before. And the last book I want to recommend is Hadley Freeman's life moves pretty fast, the lessons we learned from 80s movies, and why we don't learn them from movies anymore. I haven't actually read the whole book yet. Like, I skipped around to the chapters about the movies that I was talking about in this video, covered Ferris Bueller's Day Off and Pretty in Pink pretty extensively. But I am going to read the whole thing probably once I'm done with this video because it's really fascinating. This book really goes in depth into what made 80s films so memorable and iconic, how societal attitudes really influenced these films, the evolution of filmmaking and what's different about films today. It's really interesting. I will have like the parts of these books that I talked about in my source document. So if you check check the description of all my videos, because I have source documents for most of them, and I sourced these books pretty extensively for this video. So if you want to see which books I got all of my information from, just check that document, because I used these books a lot. So yeah, I read a lot for this video. I think I did more heavy research for this than I did on any of my college papers. So I really appreciate you taking the time to watch this whole thing. That's crazy. What are you doing? Go do something productive. Thank you so much to my Patreon subscribers and the close personal friends of Abby E tier, Anne and Harrison, and in the Severus fan club tier, Lori and Celia. Technically, only Severus fan club members are supposed to get like in-video shoutouts, but I have 5 subscribers. I think I can give the $5 folks something a little extra. Don't expect me to make a habit of it. And don't forget that I have that exclusive ill-advised video coming out on Patreon, hopefully soon, alongside ad-free versions of my previous YouTube uploads, including this one. I also have behind-the-scenes stuff, cosplay content, random musings, notes, and pictures of my cat. If you'd like to subscribe to my Patreon, the link is in the description below, along with a link to my Etsy shop and my art commissions. I really appreciate the support. I'm actually working on a lot of Etsy stuff at the moment. I've gotten really into sticker making. So if you have ideas for underrepresented fandoms, please send them my way. Once again, thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like or a comment if you enjoyed this video. It really helps me out in the almighty algorithm. Like, it takes 2 seconds. You have no idea how much that 2 seconds can really help me with my algorithm numbers. I hate YouTube. Anyway, shameless self-promotion aside, thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video. Can you see how incredibly tired I am? My God, this video was this was a labor of love, y'all. No, Seth, come back. Here's my cat.